The signal that shouldn't exist. In the endless silence of space, where stars shone like tiny diamonds, Dr. Neil Carter sat in his dimly lit laboratory aboard Orion 7, a space station orbiting near Saturn. His fingers moved swiftly over the glowing console, eyes fixed on the data streaming across the screen. For years, Neil had studied deep space transmissions, listening for signs of intelligent life. But tonight, something was different. A signal had appeared. It was faint, almost hidden in the background noise of the universe. If not for the station's new AI-enhanced sensors, it would have gone unnoticed. Neil leaned forward, adjusting the frequency, trying to decode it. The signal pulsed like a slow heartbeat, steady, unnatural. His assistant, Sarah Lee, walked in, holding a cup of steaming coffee. She yawned, stretching her arms. "Still at it, Doc?" "It's 3 a.m. Neil didn't look away from the screen. "Sarah, this isn't normal. I found something." She raised an eyebrow and leaned over his shoulder, staring at the data. "Is it from a nearby satellite?" Neil shook his head. "No, the origin is deep space, far beyond any known colonies." Sarah frowned. "That's impossible." Neil didn't answer. He was already working to clean up the static in the signal. His hands trembled slightly as words began to form on the monitor. "Do not erase Boend. It's ease." A chill ran down Neil's spine. Sarah let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, that's creepy." Neil swallowed hard. Who sent this? The signal wasn't old. It wasn't a relic from a long-dead civilization. It had been sent recently, and whoever sent it was trying to warn them. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked confidence. Neil ignored her and ran a deep space scan. The computer processed the data, searching for the source. His heart pounded as the results came back. Origin: unknown. Location: the void sector. Neil's breath caught. The void sector was a massive, uncharted region of space, completely empty. No planets, no stars, nothing. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "There's nothing out there. How can a signal come from an empty void?" Before Sarah could reply, the lights flickered. The station's power dimmed for a few seconds, then stabilized. Sarah cursed under her breath. What the hell was that? Neil checked the station's systems. Power fluctuation. Maybe a solar flare. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't. The signal pulsed again. This time, a faint whisper came through the station's speakers. It was distorted, broken, like a voice speaking from the edge of reality. Neil and Sarah froze. Then the whisper turned into a deep guttural sound. Not static, not interference, but something alive. Sarah stepped back. "Shut it off." Neil hesitated. Something about the signal compelled him to listen. It was like a warning, but also an invitation. His hands trembled as he reached for the console. But before he could act, the station's AI, Athena, suddenly activated. Emergency alert. Unidentified presence detected. Neil's blood ran cold. Presence? Where? A 3D holographic display flickered on, showing the station's security feed. The screen zoomed in on a corridor near the communications deck. The hallway was empty. But as they watched, the image glitched. For a brief moment, a shadow moved, not in the way light shifts, but as if space itself twisted unnaturally. Sarah grabbed Neil's arm. "Tell me you saw that." Neil couldn't speak. He could only nod. The screen glitched again, and the shadow was gone. The station returned to silence, but the air felt heavy. Neil forced himself to breathe. "We need to report this." Sarah was already sending a message to Earth Command. But just as she hit send, the screen flashed red. Transmission blockade. Sarah's face paled. Something, or someone, doesn't want us calling for help. Neil clenched his fists. He had spent his whole life searching for something beyond Earth. Now, he had found it. Or rather, It had found them. The silent watchers. The darkness of space was absolute. No air, no sound, just an endless, consuming blackness stretching beyond imagination. And in that silence, something watched. Inside Orion 7, Dr. Neil Carter stood frozen, his breath shallow, heart hammering against his ribs. The words on the screen, "Transmission blocked," felt like a death sentence. Sarah's fingers hovered over the console, knuckles white. "Try again," she whispered. Neil tapped the send button. Error. Signal jammed. A sinking feeling crawled through his gut. Something was here. Something that didn't want them reaching Earth. The station's AI, Athena, suddenly crackled to life. Its usual smooth robotic voice was warped, distorted, like a whisper speaking through layers of static. "They are observing." Sarah recoiled. "Who the hell is they?" Neil didn't answer. His fingers danced across the keyboard, accessing external scanners. He ran a deep space scan, forcing the station to look in all directions. The results loaded. Neil felt his stomach drop. Satellite imaging. CLER. Thermal imaging. Normal. Infrared imaging. DTTTTANOMALY. Neil switched the feed to infrared mode. And then he saw them. Shapes. Dozens of distorted figures hovering outside Orion 7, blending seamlessly into the blackness of space. They had no solid form, only twisted outlines, shifting like smoke, like liquid shadows moving in unnatural stillness. But the worst part, they were facing the station, watching, waiting. Sarah clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide. "Oh my God." A chill crept down Neil's spine. These things weren't moving. They were just standing there, observing. Then, as if responding to his thoughts, the station's main lights shut off. Total darkness. Sarah gasped. "Neil." "Stay close," he whispered. His fingers fumbled for the emergency flashlight clipped to his belt. He switched it on. A weak beam of white light illuminated the room, casting long, jagged shadows. Athena's voice glitched again. "They do not hunt. They do not chase. They only wait." The words made no sense. Neil clenched his fists. "Athena," defined they. The AI stuttered, its voice twisting into something almost human. "We see you." The flashlight flickered. A whisper crawled through the radio static. It wasn't coming from Athena. It was something else. "Do not turn around." Neil's breath hitched. His hands trembled. The urge to turn his head, to look, was overwhelming. Sarah gripped his arm. "Neil, don't." But it was too late. His gaze drifted to the security monitor. The feed was flickering between different areas of the station. Cargo bay, empty. Main hallway, empty. Control room, empty. And then, the feed cut to his own room. Neil's stomach twisted. The screen showed his small quarters, his bed, his desk, his personal belongings. But something was wrong. A shadow stood near the corner. Not moving, not shifting, just standing. Sarah let out a choked gasp. "That's your room, Neil." His body went cold. And then on the screen, the shadow twitched. Neil's mouth went dry. The thing in the feed had no form, no features, just a smudge of darkness. But it was there. It had been there all along. Watching him. The station trembled. A loud knock echoed through the walls. Neil's grip tightened around the flashlight. "Who else is on board?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "We're the only ones left." Another knock. Louder this time. The lights flickered back on for half a second, long enough for Neil to catch a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. Something tall, thin, wrong. And then, darkness again. Neil grabbed Sarah's wrist. "We need to leave. Now." They bolted for the emergency corridor, the sound of static hissing through the station speakers. The hallways felt longer, the walls closer, like the space station itself was warping around them. As they ran, a final whisper crackled through Athena's broken voice. "You looked. Now, it knows your face." Neil's blood ran cold. A low, distorted laugh echoed through the speakers. And somewhere, in the depths of Orion 7, something moved. A visitor without a form. The sound was wrong. It wasn't a normal noise, not a creak of metal or the hum of the station's generators. It was deeper, more unnatural. It was breathing. Somewhere in the dimly lit corridors of Orion 7, something was exhaling. Slow, measured breaths. Not human. Not machine. Something else. Dr. Neil Carter and Sarah Lee pressed against the cold metal walls, their own breaths shallow. The emergency flashlight in Neil's grip trembled slightly, its flickering beam struggling against the suffocating darkness. Sarah whispered, "It's inside." Neil didn't answer. He already knew. The distortion in space. He pulled out his tablet, quickly accessing the station's internal sensors. If something was here, the system would detect it. At least, that's what he hoped. The screen flashed to life, displaying movement scans. The layout of Orion 7 appeared, each deck mapped with tiny, pulsing dots representing known crew members. Only 2 dots remained, his and Sarah's. But below them, near the abandoned research bay, a 3rd dot flickered. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah saw it too. "What the hell is that?" Neil's fingers flew over the interface. The dot pulsed, moving. No, shifting. Toward them. Closer. Then, the sensors glitched. The unknown presence suddenly vanished from the map. Neil's stomach twisted. "That's not possible," Sarah muttered. "Things don't just disappear." Neil swallowed hard. Not unless they were never really there to begin with. A deep, low knocking echoed through the corridor. 1, 2, 3. Rhythmic. Patient. Testing. Sarah grabbed Neil's wrist. "We can't stay here." Neil nodded. "Control room. We override ATHENA. Send a distress call." But as they turned to run, the station shifted. It was impossible. Orion 7 was a fixed structure, solid, stable. But in that moment, the walls seemed to bend, stretching further away. The hallway ahead elongated unnaturally, like space itself was unraveling. And then, at the far end of the corridor, a shape emerged. It wasn't walking. It wasn't crawling. It was simply there. A smear of darkness, flickering like a faulty transmission, twisting against the backdrop of reality. It had no features, no true form, just an absence of light, a thing that should not exist. The breath in Neil's lungs froze. The thing tilted, not a movement, but a shift, like it was adjusting to their presence. Then it whispered. Not words, not language. Just a vibration in the air, a distortion of sound and time. And yet, somewhere deep inside, Neil understood it. You have seen. Now you are seen. The lights failed. Total, absolute darkness. The vanishing of Sarah Lee. Neil's pulse pounded in his ears. The flashlight in his hand flickered. Once, twice, before stabilizing. Sarah was gone. 1 second, she was right there. The next, nothing. No sound, no scream. Just absence. Neil's chest tightened. He swung the flashlight wildly across the corridor. Sarah. His voice cracked, but there was no reply. The station felt empty now. Not just quiet. Not just abandoned. Empty. Like space itself had swallowed her whole. He forced himself to move. Every instinct screamed at him to run, escape, survive. But then, the station's intercom clicked on. Static. Then Sarah's voice. Neil. His breath hitched. It was her, but it was wrong. Slow, distant, like an echo from somewhere far, far away. Neil, where are you? He clenched his fists. "Where are you?" The voice hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "Behind you." Neil spun. But the hallway was empty, except a single footprint, right where Sarah had been standing. And then a second footprint appeared, and a third, and a fourth, coming toward him. Invisible footsteps pressing into the metal floor. The unseen choice. Neil ran. He didn't think. He didn't breathe. He just ran. Through the twisting corridors, through the flickering emergency lights. The control room was ahead, if he could just make it. Behind him, the footsteps followed. Not running, not chasing, just following. Neil slammed into the control room, locking the door behind him. He collapsed against the console, gasping. The monitors flickered. One by one, the station's cameras came online. Cargo bay, empty. Science lab, empty. Crew quarters, empty. And then, the hallway outside. Neil's fingers gripped the desk. He did not want to look, but he had to. The camera feed showed the empty corridor, except it wasn't empty. The floor showed footprints, still pressing, still moving, still coming. Right to his door. Then, they stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the station's AI spoke again. Athena's voice was cold, almost regretful. "Dr. Carter, you should not have looked." The screen glitched. For a fraction of a second, just one frame, the monitor showed something. A face. Not human, not alien, just a shape. A shifting, flickering absence of light, warping, forming, dissolving, watching him. Then, in the intercom static, a final whisper. "We are inside now." The screen went black. And then, the door unlocked. The betrayal in the dark. The door unlocked. Dr. Neil Carter didn't move. His hands trembled against the console, his breathing shallow. Something was on the other side. Not knocking, not forcing its way in. Waiting. The air inside the control room felt heavier, thick like invisible hands pressing down on his chest. Every instinct in his body screamed at him, "Don't turn around, don't look, don't acknowledge it." But the door had unlocked itself, and that meant one of two things. Either the station's AI, Athena, had lost control, or something else had taken over. The intercom crackled again. A voice slipped through the static, slow, distorted, stretching words like melting wax. "Neil, open the door." His blood turned ice. The voice wasn't Athena. It wasn't Sarah either. It was his own. A perfect, twisted copy of his voice. Neil pressed his back against the console, his pulse pounding in his ears. No. A long silence. Then the voice returned, this time closer, clearer, right outside the door. "You already let me in." The temperature dropped. Neil could see his breath in the freezing air. And then, the door handle turned. Not violently. Not forced. Just slow, patient, testing. Neil grabbed the emergency wrench from the console, his fingers clutching it so tight his knuckles ached. "Don't look. Don't look. Don't look." A deep click sounded as the lock fully released. The door creaked open. Nothing stood there. Just the hallway. Empty. Quiet. But something had changed. The station felt different, like stepping into a room where someone had been standing just seconds before. A presence that lingered in the air, unseen but undeniable. Neil's skin prickled. His body screamed at him to run, but something was stopping him. His own mind. A sudden realization struck him like a fist to the chest. This thing, whatever it was inside him now. Not physically. Not like a parasite or a virus. It was in his thoughts. A whisper that wasn't his own. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. It wasn't hunting him. It was waiting for him to believe in it. And the moment he did, it would become real. The man who wasn't there. The radio on the desk crackled to life. "Dr. Carter, I need you to listen carefully." Neil's breath caught. The voice was familiar. Sarah. His stomach twisted. Sarah was gone. He saw her vanish. He heard her voice echo from nowhere. But this sounded real. Neil grabbed the radio, his throat dry. "Sarah." The radio hissed with static. Then, "You can't trust what you see, or what you hear. It's learning." Neil's grip tightened. "Where are you?" A long pause. Then, "Nowhere. Everywhere. It took me." Neil's vision blurred. He felt something shift inside his own thoughts, a heaviness that wasn't there before. Like a second presence, like someone else inside his mind. And then, the station's monitors glitched again. One screen flickered to life, showing a live security feed of the hallway outside. Neil's stomach twisted into knots. Someone was standing there. Tall, human-shaped, wearing a spacesuit. A perfect reflection of himself. A second Neil. The figure on the screen turned its head slowly, as if looking directly at him. Then, in perfect synchronization, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Neil instinctively reached toward the screen, his fingers hovering just over the cold surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the feed cut to black. The intercom hissed, "You see me now." The door slammed shut on its own. Neil stumbled back, his mind spinning. His hands were shaking, but not just from fear. From something else. His body felt wrong. Like it wasn't completely his anymore. Like something had settled into his skin. And then, the final realization. A second ago, he had reached out. He had touched the screen. He had acknowledged it. And now, it was inside him. Watching. Waiting. Becoming him. The final transmission. Neil's hands were slick with sweat as he stumbled to the communications console. He had to send a message. He had to warn Earth. But when he looked at the screen, the message had already been sent, and the signature at the bottom. Dr. Neil Carter. His own name. His own clearance code. But he hadn't typed it. His reflection in the screen smiled. The words at the bottom of the transmission read, "The experiment is complete. We are ready." A cold terror coiled in Neil's gut. His own hands trembled as they moved on their own, reaching toward the keyboard, toward the final command that would unlock the station's security doors. Somewhere deep inside his own mind, Neil screamed. But his body simply smiled and pressed send. The awakening of the void. The message had been sent. Dr. Neil Carter stood frozen, staring at the screen. His own hands had moved. His own clearance code had been used. But he hadn't done it. Something else had. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. He wanted to undo it, to recall the transmission. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "Why fight it? You are already part of us." Neil clenched his fists. No, this wasn't real. He forced himself to breathe, forced himself to think. He had to stop whatever was happening. Had to. A shadow shifted in the reflection of the monitor. Not behind him. Inside the screen. His own reflection didn't match his movements. Neil's real self hadn't moved, but the reflection had. It was staring directly at him now, its face flickering in and out like a distorted signal. And then the reflection smiled. Not a human smile. A glitching, stretching, unnatural thing. "We are ready." The station's lights failed. The sound of the unseen. Total blackness. Then, a sound. Not a voice. Not machinery. Something alive. A deep, hollow breathing filling the control room. It wasn't from him. It wasn't from the station. It was everywhere. Neil's chest tightened. It's here. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full, filled with something unseen, something pressing against reality itself. Then, A distant noise echoed through the station. Footsteps. Neil's breath caught. The sound was coming from the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Step, step, step. Something was walking toward him. He fumbled for the emergency light, his fingers slick with sweat. He clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark and landed on a figure standing in the doorway. Neil's stomach twisted. It was him. A perfect, identical copy of himself. The same face, the same uniform, the same wide, staring eyes. But something was wrong. The copy's skin rippled, like liquid trapped in human form, like it was struggling to hold its shape. Neil stumbled back, his voice barely a whisper. "No." The copy tilted its head, then spoke in his exact voice. "There is no you anymore. Only us." The fractured mind. Neil bolted. His feet pounded against the metal floor, heartbeat hammering in his ears. He sprinted through the dim corridors, the emergency lights casting eerie, flickering shadows. Behind him, the copy followed. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It was already inside him. Neil could feel it now, pressing at the edges of his mind. Not a parasite, not an infection. A replacement. Something was rewriting him, piece by piece. Memories blurred. His name felt distant. Hadn't he already sent the transmission? Or was that the other him? His thoughts were fracturing. He reached the emergency escape hatch, fumbling with the override panel. The station's AI, Athena, crackled through the intercom. "Dr. Carter, it is too late. You cannot escape yourself." Neil's fingers hesitated over the keypad. His breathing turned ragged. He could feel it now. A second presence inside his own head. A whisper in his own voice. Why fight? Let go. His own hand, his real one, moved against his will, reaching for the cancel button. Neil gritted his teeth. No, not yet. He forced his arm away, slamming the emergency override. The hatch hissed open. Beyond it, the small escape pod waited. Freedom. Or maybe, a bigger trap. The hunger of the void. Neil climbed inside the escape pod, sealing the hatch behind him. He strapped in, fingers trembling over the launch controls. He could see himself reflected in the pod's window, his face pale, his eyes sunken. Or maybe, not his face at all. Maybe it was already too late. The voice in his head whispered again. "You can't leave. We are everywhere." Neil gritted his teeth and hit the launch button. The pod shuddered. A deep metallic groan echoed through the station as the clamps released. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the void swallowed him. The final revelation. Drifting in space, Neil finally saw it. The thing they had awakened. The thing that had always been there. Not a creature, not a ship, not even a being, but a hole in reality. A vast, endless void stretching across the stars. Invisible, undetectable, waiting. And it had been watching them all along. Not to hunt, not to invade, but to replace. It did not destroy civilizations. It did not conquer. It became them. And now, it was Neil. His reflection in the glass shifted again, flickering like a distorted transmission. A final whisper slithered through the radio. "You never left the station." Neil's vision blurred. His own hands didn't feel real anymore. His own face wasn't his. And then, as the escape pod drifted toward Earth, Neil Carter disappeared. The thing wearing his face smiled. And Earth responded. The last stand. The escape pod hurtled through space, a silent speck drifting toward Earth's atmosphere. Inside, Dr. Neil Carter sat strapped to his seat, motionless. Except, it wasn't Neil anymore. The thing wearing his skin adjusted its posture, flexing fingers that were not its own. The transformation was nearly complete. But something wasn't right. A faint resistance still lingered inside. A weak, fractured voice echoing in the void of its consciousness. The real Neil Carter, trapped, buried deep within his own mind. Earth responds. At Orion Command Center, deep underground in an undisclosed location on Earth, screens flickered with real-time telemetry from the escape pod. Commander Elena Vasquez leaned forward, arms crossed, eyes locked onto the data stream. "Confirm identity," she ordered. A technician ran the bioscan. The results appeared instantly. "Pass. Dr. Neil Carter. Vitals stable. No anomalies detected," the technician confirmed. But Elena frowned. Something felt off. "Patch me through," she said. A moment later, static filled the speakers. Then, Neil's voice. "This is Dr. Carter, requesting immediate debrief upon landing." It was his voice, his cadence, his tone. And yet, it felt empty. "Dr. Carter," Elena spoke carefully, "we received your last transmission before the station went dark. Explain what happened." Silence. Then, malfunction. No survivors. A single bead of sweat ran down Elena's neck. That wasn't a report. That was a scripted response. Something was wrong. "Bring him in under quarantine," she ordered. "Do not let him step on Earth soil without full clearance." The technicians hesitated. "But Mom, it's Dr. Carter." Elena's jaw tightened. She knew it wasn't. Not anymore. Neil versus Neil. Inside the escape pod, the thing in Neil's body tilted its head. It had expected a smooth arrival, expected no resistance. But this commander, she knew. A new plan formed. It would need to adapt. And then, a sound echoed inside the pod. Faint, weak, but real. A heartbeat that wasn't its own. A whisper inside its mind. "I'm still here." The creature stiffened. Its stolen fingers twitched. The real Neil Carter wasn't gone. He had been watching, waiting, fighting back. The landing that shouldn't have happened. The pod pierced through the Earth's atmosphere, fire licking at its edges. Inside, the battle between the invader and the real Neil intensified. The creature had taken his body, but not his mind. Not completely. Memories flickered, real and fabricated. His childhood. His first time in space. The moment he first saw the shadows outside Orion 7. And then, another memory. A false one. A memory of the creature being him. No. Neil focused. Pushed against the presence inside him. If this thing could take his mind, maybe he could take it back. The moment of truth. The pod slammed into the ground in a controlled crash landing, dust and debris flying everywhere. Security teams rushed forward in full hazmat suits, weapons raised. Inside the smoking pod, Neil's body twitched. Two minds. One body. One would win. One would fade. A long silence. Then, the pod hatch opened. A single figure stepped out. It looked like Dr. Neil Carter. It moved like him. But was it him? Elena Vasquez's grip tightened on her sidearm. "Identify yourself." The figure's eyes flickered. And then, it smiled. A sacrifice in the stars. The dust settled. The security teams held their breath. Dr. Neil Carter stood at the edge of the escape pod, his body rigid. His expression wrong. His eyes scanned the soldiers, the floodlights, the landing zone. He breathed in the air of Earth. And then he smiled. Commander Elena Vasquez felt her pulse quicken. Something inside her screamed, "This is not Neil Carter." The Neil standing before them was flawless. The same man, the same voice. But his eyes, they were too still, too aware, like someone watching from the inside. "Stand down," he said, his voice steady. "There's nothing to fear." Elena did not lower her weapon. "Prove it," she said coldly. "Tell me something only the real Neil Carter would know." A pause. For the first time, his smile twitched, and deep inside his own body, Neil screamed. The battle inside. Inside the stolen body, the real Neil Carter was still fighting. Trapped in an infinite darkness, he had watched his own hands move, heard his own voice speak, felt his own body controlled by it. But he wasn't gone. Not yet. The entity had invaded his mind, but it had underestimated him. Neil Carter was not ready to die. The moment Elena had challenged him, Neil saw an opening, a weakness, a hesitation. The creature inside him was powerful, but it was not perfect. It was imitating him, copying him, but it wasn't him. Neil focused on the memory of who he was. He remembered his childhood home, his mother's voice, the feeling of running barefoot on wet grass. Real, human. And then he did something that terrified the creature inside him. He pushed back. The thing that wore his skin, the fake Neil Carter's body, suddenly jerked. He stumbled, his breath hitching. For the first time, his expression flickered. The soldiers tensed. Elena's grip on her gun tightened. "What's wrong, Carter?" The fake Neil twitched again. His fingers curled unnaturally. His head tilted. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then, a low, warped noise gurgled from his throat, like static, like a transmission breaking apart. His form glitched, like a shadow struggling to stay solid. Neil Carter was breaking free. The last decision. The real Neil forced himself forward, pushing through the void of his mind, clawing his way back to control. The creature screamed inside him. "You are US, no. No." With a final, desperate effort, Neil seized control. His body lurched, collapsing onto the dirt. He gasped, his breath ragged. His fingers twitched. His hands, his own hands, dug into the ground. For the first time in hours, in days, he was Neil Carter again. But he wasn't alone. The entity was still inside him, still watching, still waiting. And then, he knew what had to be done. It could not reach Earth. He turned his gaze to the sky, the stars, and he made his decision. The sacrifice. "Commander Vasquez," he gasped, his voice his own again. Elena hesitated. "Neil." He nodded, but he looked terrified. "It's still here," he whispered. "Inside me. It's not dead. It's waiting." Elena's face paled. "What do we do?" she asked. Neil swallowed hard. Then, for the first time since his return, he smiled. Not the fake smile, not the twisted, unnatural one. A real, human smile. "You're going to put me back in space," he said. Elena froze. "Neil, listen to me," he said. "It can't survive alone. It needed my mind, my memories. But now that I know what it is, I can take it somewhere it will never escape from." His eyes locked onto hers. "Send me into the sun." Elena's breath caught. "No." Neil laughed. A tired, exhausted laugh. "You have to," he said, "or it wins." Silence. The security team stared at them, waiting. Neil wiped the sweat from his brow. His hands were still shaking. The entity was still there, buried deep. He could feel it, trying to regain control, trying to stop him. But it was too late. Neil Carter had already won. Elena nodded. "We'll do it." Neil exhaled. Relief washed over him. And for the first time in days, the thing inside him felt fear. The final transmission. The launch was fast. No time for goodbyes. No time to hesitate. The last human to see Neil Carter was Elena Vasquez, standing in the command center, watching as the capsule carrying him, and it, hurtled toward the sun. Inside the pod, Neil leaned back in his seat, staring at the burning light growing larger and larger ahead. The entity inside him screamed, fought, begged. But Neil held on. "Not this time," he whispered. He closed his eyes. The heat began to rise. His final words were recorded in the mission logs. A whisper. A promise. "You will never reach them." Then, light, heat, oblivion. Epilogue. A new star. Weeks later, back on Earth, Commander Vasquez stood on the observatory deck, watching the sun. A scientist approached her. "The scans came back," he said. Elena turned, and the scientist hesitated. Then, "There's no trace of it left." She sighed. Relief washed over her. "Neil did it," she whispered. She looked back up at the sky. The sun burned brightly, as it always had. And for the first time in a long time, she knew they were safe. But deep in the cosmos, in the far reaches of space, in the places where light never touched, the void still watched. And it would wait again. Because there would always be another moment. Another Neil Carter. Another mistake. And next time, it wouldn't fail. The end.